Hello, so today I'm joined by Stefanie Holt, Whisky Ambassador for Speciality Brands, who are the UK distributor for Kavalan in the UK. Hey Steph, how's it going?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very, very well. Very excited to be speaking to you today. Now, Kavalan might not be a brand that all of all of the people watching this have come across before. It's obviously Taiwanese whiskey, which I get very excited about, being a long time fan of Kavalan. But it's something that a lot of people perhaps haven't come across before, being more familiar with the traditional producing countries of whiskey. So could you tell me a little bit about Kavalan, about how they got started and how they got to where they are today?
Absolutely. So the distillery was actually built in 2005. So they haven't been producing for very long. But there's actually, they wanted to start making whiskey a lot earlier. It's a family owned business owned by Mr. Lee. And his father had wanted to make whiskey for about 20 years before he was able to build a distillery. And this is partly because Taiwan used to have a monopoly on alcohol production. So only the government was able to produce alcohol. Then in 2002, Taiwan joined the World Trade Organization, and as part of that, they had to loosen up some little regulations. And so the monopoly it allowed independent businesses to be able to make alcohol. So instantly, Mr. Lee sent researchers, hired consultants. The late Dr. Jim Swan was a very important one to Kavalan, and they started working on producing Taiwan's first single malt.
Fantastic. So sort of threw themselves into it as soon as was possible. And was that enthusiasm, did that come from the fact that whiskey was already a big category in Taiwan at the time, or was he sort of just a lone whiskey fan in Taiwan?
So yeah, Taiwan is a huge fan of Scotch whisky and single malt. They've been importing lots and lots of it for many years. It's a big sort of status symbol, and one of the biggest value importers in Asia of single malts. They've been wanting to, sort of get it, I think, for a while. I don't think anyone actually ever thought they'd build a distillery and start making their own single malts. But it took, someone who's a massive fan to be able to get that going. Huge investment and very risky. It might not have worked in that climate at all. Taiwan's on the Tropic of Cancer, so it's tropical or subtropical climate. Very warm, nice and humid, just like Scotland, but much warmer all year round. So quite a risky business building a distillery there.
Yeah, it's not exactly the first place people would have perhaps thought to. Although it's that humidity and that climate that I understand really makes Kavalan and the whiskey they make there quite unique. So I was wondering, could you perhaps dive into that a little bit? How do Kavalan produce their whiskey there? Would somebody who's been to a Scotch whiskey distillery recognise what's going on Kavalan, or is it completely different?
No, I mean you'd see all the same bits as you see in Scotland and a Scottish distillery. You'd be tons warmer. Obviously, you're wandering around in a very warm place, and then you walk into the distillery and they're boiling things in metal, so it's even hotter. Whereas in Scotland, I think quite often when you tour a distillery, you're glad of that extra bit of warmth. Here you are not glad, and pictures of yourself do not turn out nicely if you try and take some. But yeah, so they've had to obviously adjust a few bits and bobs. So, for example, their yeast strains, they use French and South African yeast strains. The South African particularly good at dealing with operating in slightly warmer temperatures and giving fruity flavors, which is the distillery style. They also have to have a second condenser on their stills to make sure all the alcohol vapor is condensed properly. In Scotland, that's fine with one condenser because it's cold and you stick it outside and everything's okay. But with Kavalan, it's all inside, and to make sure they've captured all the alcohol vapor, they've got the second condenser as well. So there's a few little bits, but the main thing is about the aging, of course. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that whiskies aged in warmer climates will age faster than they would do in Scotland or Ireland. And that's the same in Taiwan. So it's about 3 to 4 times faster. And the angel share is a hideous quantity. So just dealing with that.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's something I think that in whiskey circles we definitely talk about that huge amount of loss that you get once you go to these much more interesting climates perhaps than we have here in Scotland. Obviously, Scotland and maturation here is very famous for being sort of very stable. There's not a lot of temperature fluctuation. pretty humid if you're in a dunnage, but obviously nothing compared to what's going on at Kavalan. So when they get down to saying, right, okay, we want to build a warehouse and fill it full of casks, are there measures that they have to take to regulate the temperature there, or is there anything they can do to try and sort of curb that angel share?
Yeah, there's a wee bit. So they're not trying to temperature control their warehouses because they are making Taiwanese whiskey rather than trying to sort of make a fake sort of Scottish climate in their warehouses. So they are accepting of where they are, and like I say, that's on purposefully what they're doing. But there's a few things that they use. So Kavalan distilleries in the northeast of Taiwan in the Yilan province. And here they actually in the winter get a lot of winds from Siberia. So they come out of Russia, go round a bit of the ocean around Japan, and then come in that northeast corner of Taiwan. And so in the winter, the distillery gets some nice cold winds at night, which help sort of regulate the temperature a little bit and cool things down. They will open the windows, it's high tech there, to catch that breeze. And like I say, increase the sort of temperature variation and cool things down a little bit. Also in the summer, in the hottest parts of the day, they'll spray the floors, and the floors are concrete here, and it's a 5-story warehouse. They'll spray the floors with water, which will evaporate, increase the humidity in the room, which decreases slightly the angel share. So when they started the distillery and they started aging casks, the angel share was about 12 to 16% a year, which they were not expecting it to be quite that much. They thought it was going to be more, but they hadn't realized it was going to be quite so excessive. So using these measures, and particularly the water, they've actually managed to get it down to about 10 to 12% a year now. They'd like to see it down to sort of 8 to 10% if they can. But like I say, they don't want to sort of start adding in, any kind of cooling mechanisms. So it's just about humidity control and getting a bit of breeze coming through.
That's so it's so interesting to see that how they're having to sort of manage these very different conditions. And my understanding as well is that they use some really interesting casks at Kavalan too. So they have this interesting maturation environment, but then you go into that warehouse and there's lots going on. I've seen things like Moscatel casks and various different types of sherry casks. I've even seen some of them actually being seasoned over in Jerez as well. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit about that and how that then plays into their stock portfolio?
Yeah, so they're very famous actually, their range, for having this incredible selection at the top end of their range. So their sort of standard range are all whiskies that are a combination of casks together, and they're rounded and well balanced and easy drinking. But then they have a range called the soloist range, and they're named after the soloist in an orchestra. So it's a single cask strength. And there are currently 9 types available in the UK, but there are more available sort of as sort of limited release bottlings or at the distillery itself. But their cask program is absolutely incredible. They go and visit Porto, the Jerez area, lots of different wineries, many places to get to source top quality casks. So they don't just do a sherry cask kind of finish. These solists are all aged in first fill casks, so they are the most intense flavor you can get from that type of cask type, not combined with any other cask type. And they also have all the different types of sherry. So you've got Fino, Manzanilla, Moscatel, Amontillado, and Pedro Jimenez as well. So lots and lots going on there. They're also quite famous for one called Vinho Barrique, which was awarded the Whisky Awards Best Single Malt in the World in 2015. And that is a wine cask that has undergone what's called the STR process. It was something that Dr. Jim Swan developed with them. So it's a wine cask that's been shaved first, then toasted and recharred. And it gives a very, very intense and incredible flavor.
That's it's funny that STR cask. My understanding is it's actually a bit of a hallmark of the late Dr. Swan. It's something that he really worked on developing and nurtured and implemented. And I think thinking back, Kavalan must have been one of the earlier adopters of STR casks. So could you perhaps I think a lot of people aren't familiar with it. So could you perhaps delve a little bit more into that? It's obviously it's shaved, toasted, and recharred. It's formerly a wine cask, but why would you want to do that to a cask?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, when you've made a wine cask, you will have filled it with the wine, and they've got all the kind of residue from the wine going on in there. But also, it might have sort of leached some of the flavors from the inside of the cask. So shaving that off will make sure. You also want a bit of consistency, so you don't want the difference between a red wine or a white wine or different grapes sort of influencing. So the shaving's a little part to do with that. Then the toasting is opening up the pores in the wood and starts helping the wood molecules break down and convert into those lovely, delicious sort of vanilla, spicy flavors rather than being a bit tannic and bitter. And then the recharring is caramelizing the wood sugars and helping sort of the open up the wood so you get sort of deeper penetration of the liquid into the staves. So it's it's a bit of a signature. Even if you visit a distillery and they don't mention Dr. Jim Swan and it's a newer distillery, and then they say that they're doing an STR cask, you're instantly like, oh, hold on, I know who was involved in setting you guys up.
So I understand that they have quite an interesting and unusual warehouse at Kavalan. Can you tell us a little bit about that? It's sort of the multi-story warehouse, something that you wouldn't be usually familiar with.
Yeah, so there's another interesting thing that these guys do for their warehouse layout. It's 5 stories high, and again, because of the heat, the top floor of the warehouse has the sun beating down on the roof, and it's extremely hot in the top floor, slightly less hot on the next floor down, and so on to the bottom when it's the coolest floor. And because your ex-bourbon or American oak casks are smaller, things would usually age faster in those because of the higher wood to liquid ratio compared to your sherry casks or your port pipes, which would age slower because they're bigger casks. So what they do is they put the bigger casks at the top where it's hottest, not to speed them up a little bit, but just to make them age at the same rate as the ones at the bottom. So they're all aging at a high speed comparative to over here. But they're all aging at the same rate. Whereas if you put those small casks up on the top, they would be done in 9 to 12 months, and you don't want that. So they're trying to make everything. They bottle usually all their casks between 4.5 and 9 years old. So they're trying to make sure that they're all ready after around that long.
So now we've talked a little bit about the founding of the distillery and the unique maturation environment they have there. I guess it's quite important to talk about the whiskey and the spirit itself. So before we dive into this lovely dram that we've got, could you tell me a little bit about the actual spirit style of the distillery? You know, if before it goes into those casks and undergoes that incredible maturation period, what is the house style of Kavalan?
It's predominantly really fruity. That they don't want any kind of bitter flavors. The fermentation tanks are actually sort of got water jackets around them to make sure they don't get too hot, to avoid any bitter flavors being produced. So fruitiness, very, very light. There's some floral kind of aspects in there. Really smooth as well. Actually, when I visited a couple of years ago and tasted the new make, and it's, I mean, worryingly drinkable straight off the still by itself. I think what you find in a hot country as well quite often is that flavors and alcohol is more aggressive when you smell it when it's warm. And so they're all sort of testing it and trying everything to check that it's ready over in the heat. And so for them to decide that it's smooth enough to bottle, then when we taste it in a sort of slightly cooler climate, it feels extremely smooth to us because of it's not so hot.
So they've got this wonderfully palatable new make spirit, which obviously is not the case with all whiskies. You know, you get some that have, you know, really quite pungent or unpleasant new makes that nevertheless turn into lovely whiskies. But they've got this this actually very elegant fruity style that then goes into an incredible variety of casks for this fantastic maturation period. So we've now come to sort of the end of that period. It's been matured, and we've ended up with this mix of different cask types in the glass for the classic single malt. Can you tell us a little bit about this particular expression and what goes into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a combination of about 6 or 7 different cask types together, and this is their classic single malt. So this was their first release that they released. It was actually 10 years ago, last year. They did their first release in Taiwan. Then it eventually kind of came over to Europe after that. But this one is kind of your sweeter, fruitier casks, so your sweeter sherries, and then obviously lots and lots of American oak. They've realised that European oak doesn't really play nice in the heat. It gives you much more tannic, sort of bitter flavours. So actually when they're getting their sherry casks produced, they're asking for them to be made from American oak as well. So even if it's a sherry cask for cavallan, it will be also American oak coming in there. So you're going to get that vanilla and the butterscotch and the toffee. And then coming sort of alongside those fruity notes from the distillate, you're going to get that coconut kind of flavor, again, coming from the oak, which I think is something you don't get so much when you're talking about American oak casks used in more temperate zones. The coconut's a little bit harder to get a hold of, whereas in the tropical areas, coconut is a really big flavor coming through.
Fantastic. I have to say, I'm a big fan of cavallan, and have been since my first experience of it was back in 2015 when they won that particularly big award from the World Whiskies Awards, and I think that was definitely a good place to start with the brand. But this is still a lovely whiskey, and I think you're quite right. It's unlike the Solist range, which is all about very, very big flavors and really lets you drill down into particular different cask types and how it interacts with the spirit. This is a fantastic example of exactly what a balanced style of cavallan can be all about. When blending is brought into that as well.
Yeah, and I think they want to make it super drinkable. This is 40% ABV. It was their first release, so let's introduce it to everyone. And I think also you've got to imagine you are drinking it somewhere warm. Hard enough as it might be to imagine if you look outside right now, whenever you are tasting this. Do imagine yourself somewhere warm, with a bit of humidity. The whiskey's very, very much designed to be able to handle that. And again, some whiskies are designed to warm you up and put hairs on your chest. This one is actually really refreshing. So I think if you maybe put down your whiskey drinking a little bit in the summer, because the type of whiskey you like isn't suited to that, this one is great to sort of substitute in there.
So something else that I think's wonderful about cavallan is that they have a very, very unique bottle shape and look. You see it on a shelf and you know exactly that you're looking at cavallan. So can you tell us a little bit about it and why it's so different?
Yeah, absolutely. I love these as well, actually, and it's actually based, again, linking to Taiwan. So when they started building the distillery, Taiwan had just in Taipei completed a building that was the world's tallest building at that point. It's now the 8th tallest building in the world, or it was last time I checked. People are always sticking another spike on one of theirs to make theirs taller. But Taipei 101 is the name of the tower, and it's absolutely beautiful. And this bottle shape is based on that. I think when a lot of people think of Taiwan actually as well, you sort of think of skyscrapers, tall buildings, neon lights. That's definitely what I picture. So it kind of is a little bit reminiscent of that. The interesting thing about the distillery actually, it's in the northeast of the country, which is not the built up area. The Yilan province has got the kind of purest air and the cleanest water coming off the snowy mountains. Not that they ever get snowy, it's so hot. But yeah, so it's really distinctive bottle. I like the wide shoulders, and that's their homage to Taipei 101.
That's great, and they have as well. I think it's not just that that particular bottle with that architectural link as well. That's quite extravagant. The Solist range as well has this fantastic. This is you don't get much more opulent than this. I think it's fantastic, and I love the little ribbons and things that you get on them too. I mean, it's very distinctive, and it feels very very cavallan, which is always something that's nice to have, particularly at a time when lots of different rebrands are being done, and it's great when you see a brand that's really got their own personality.
Not keen on at all, actually. It's very single malt focused. It's funny actually, because I think working also with the Japanese brand, we hear a lot about blending, we hear a lot about highballs and mizuwaris, and then when we took on cavallan, we were kind of expecting it to be a little bit similar, and it's not at all. Actually, even when I was visiting the distillery, we were having dinner. I quite wanted a highball. We'd been doing the distillery, tasting neat whiskey all day, and I wanted a long drink. I wanted to carry on drinking whiskey, but I thought a highball would be perfect, and it was not possible. it was not possible to get. So yes, it's very much a single malt focused culture. There are no plans to make a blend. There are now a couple of other distilleries opened up in the country. So Taiwan, Kavalan was the first single malt distillery in Taiwan, but now other people obviously have seen the success and are starting a Taiwanese whiskey category, which is lovely to see. Quite exciting, and who knows where that will go in a few years. But no, single malts currently is all that's happening.
So, if somebody tastes the whiskey and really falls in love with Kavalan and thinks, right, my next holiday, I'm going to Taiwan. Can they visit the distillery? Are there tours and tastings available there?
Absolutely, there are, and I'd really strongly recommend going to Taiwan. Actually, I unfortunately, when I went, I looked on the internet and it said it wasn't a good place to go on holiday. It's either this rainy season or that rainy season, and typhoons, and no, didn't mention beaches, which are the thing that I go to places for apart from whiskey. And the country was absolutely stunning, much greener than I expected, particularly that eastern coast. There are beautiful beaches. It was not raining all the time. And the distillery is incredible to visit. It's free. They get over 1.4 million visitors per year. It was a couple of years ago, obviously not this year. And at that time, it was more than all of the distilleries in Scotland added together, which was amazing. So very, very beautiful setup, though. There's an amazing kind of European style building that you go into as a visitor centre, and then they have much stricter rules there for allowing people into distilleries and to stick their heads in mash tuns and stills than we have in Scotland. So they actually have to have it separated off, but they've built a sort of walkway that goes alongside the distillery with glass walls so that you can see at every stage of the production process. And smell it as well. They've drilled some holes in the glass to make sure you can smell all the different bits. And then there's a tasting at the end. And they've actually also recently done a blending experience. So you can have lots of the single cask options and add them together to see if you can recreate the classic or recreate one of the other kind of cavallan releases. So it's an amazing experience.
So that's not something that people necessarily would have jumped to straight away, this idea of peated Taiwanese whiskey. But, just like Kavalan has started the trend that's now becoming a Taiwanese whiskey category, do you think there's are we going to start seeing sort of the equivalent of Taiwanese Isla at some point, and different, maybe even different whiskey regions within the country? So that'll be fascinating to see how that develops.
Up until now, all Kavalan releases have been made with unpeated barley, and they hadn't really thought about making a peated style initially. The flavours of the whiskies that get imported into Taiwan are usually more the sort of on the lower peaty side of the peaty scale. But I think after sort of looking into it and after being successful in making Kavalan for quite a few years, then they were looking at, well, what else could we do and what else would be interesting? So about 4 years ago, they shipped over some peated barley and they started distilling that. They're keeping the sort of stills separate at the time. They've got 10 pairs of stills now. And they have been aging it ever since. I tasted some that wasn't quite 3 years old last year, and it was very, very nice. Really interesting, again, with those tropical flavors with the peat. Very, very interesting combination. And I think they've just released one in Taiwan at the distillery. So hopefully some more of those will be coming over to Europe soon.
So for those of our viewers who've really enjoyed their dram, they're really intrigued by Kavalan, where can they follow the brand on social media?
So it's on Instagram and Twitter. It's Kavalan Whiskey, Kavalan. And they also have a great website as well and quite a lot of video content on YouTube. There's actually one on the STR process that we've discussed, which got some very sexy images of casks being charred. So I highly recommend looking at that if that's what you're into. And if anyone wants to find it in the UK, it's available to buy at the Whisky Exchange. And if you've got a local whiskey shop as well, then do check it out.
And so for people that do manage to make it over to Taiwan to visit Kavalan, I understand there's actually something else that's been going on that's separate from the Distillery Visitor Centre that's quite interesting. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so they've opened up a cocktail bar in Taipei. So not too far, you get off the plane and it's about half an hour away. You can get yourself some Kavalan drinks in there. They've obviously got the whole range to be able to taste. And I've been working with some incredible mixologists to be able to put together some cocktails as well. So there is, it's really, really easy to go and experience some Kavalan. I also highly recommend dumplings. There's a place called Din Tai Fung, which is also in London now, but it originated in Taiwan. And these soup dumplings with a little spot of Kavalan on the side work brilliant.
Fantastic. Well, I am now hungry and thirsty. So thank you so much for your time, Stef. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you and learning about Kavalan.